Welcome, early American literature friends. This video is going to guide you through The Black Cat, the Edgar Allan Poe story. It says right here, published 1845, and there was an expanded and more definitive version published in 1845. This story is actually first published in 1843. It was immediately popular. Poe was already a celebrity, a literary celebrity when this was published. He was already a very popular writer, and this almost immediately became one of his more famous stories. It is also, especially if you take the other two stories that we're dealing with, Cask of Amontillado and Masque of the Red Death, this story is a little more complicated. If you think of Poe as a sort of pre-psychological writer, because when Poe was writing, we didn't even have the concept of psychology, but over and over again in his stories, many of his most famous stories are interested in the sort of inner workings of the human mind and what drives people to do extreme, out of the ordinary actions, or what drives them to out of the ordinary behaviors. And by the time you get to the end of this story, there is a pattern of behavior. Like the narrator has full-blown alcoholism and has this repeated pattern of like acting out violence on people. And so it's a little bit more complicated than like one isolated act or just one or two characters going back and forth, like what happens in Cask of Amontillado. The story is a little bit more complex. It's definitely the most complex of the three that are on our syllabus. There's also, and that complexity begins right in the first paragraph, because he says, for the most wild yet most homely narrative which I'm about to pen, so he's like, I'm just going to straight up tell the facts, but these are wild facts. I neither expect nor solicit belief. He starts off right from the beginning. I'm going to tell you the story. I don't expect you to believe it because it's just wild. Mad indeed would I be to expect it in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely I do not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. That's an important sentence. He leads you to that. Tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. Because this whole story reads as a criminal confession. This is a criminal who will be executed, and you find out at the end of the story he's going to be executed for murder and for concealing the body. This is somebody who's facing execution, and so the story is his sort of confession for what drove him to the murder and how he ended up in this place where he is facing execution tomorrow. And for him, that story starts off with the next paragraph. From my infancy, he wants to give you this, the narrator wants to give you this context. I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. So he was just always this sweet, kind-hearted, nice, easygoing person. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions, and I was especially fond of animals. And so you get these two key concepts here. He's just, as a child and all his life, he has this sweet, docile, tender heart, and he's especially fond of animals. Always has pets. His parents get him pets. With these, I spent most of my time and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. So you get that. You get those two traits set up, him being so kind and tender-hearted and his love of animals. That transitions you into, I married early, was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own, observing my partiality for domestic pets. And so you find out that he and his wife, when they have a house together, they have all these pets: birds, goldfish, dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. And the cat comes last. The latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, sagacious to an astonishing degree. And so the cat, even here, the cat mirrors him, because the cat is this very kind-hearted, happy, sagacious animal who's sort of their two demeanors and their attitudes and their sort of countenances, the narrator and the cat, fit each other. They fit together well. Pluto was the cat's name, my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. That's an important detail later, that he followed me wherever I went around the house, because when the second cat comes, it sort of mirrors that behavior, but it is not in a positive, happy way. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language, and at length I even offered her personal violence. And so what you get right here, this is an important moment because the narrator gives you an explanation for the dark turn. a lot of times in Poe stories, there's a dark turn, and it's not necessarily clear or certain why you're getting the dark turn. Here, the story makes it clear. And intemperance would have been a very familiar word to people in the 1800s, because intemperance would have meant alcoholism for them, not being, or intemperance really refers to using alcohol in a way that you cannot control, that your use of alcohol has gotten out of control. You can't control yourself around alcohol. You can't be temperate, you're intemperate. You're alcoholic, you're an alcoholic and can't control your use of alcohol. And so what drives the story forward, a lot of Poe stories are interested in what brings the darkness into the story, what brings the darkness out of a person, or what brings the darkness into the story. Here, Poe keys in and makes it really clear right from the beginning that darkness comes from the main character, the narrator's alcoholism, which then drives him to verbally and physically abuse his wife and all the animals. For Pluto, however, I still retain sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him. Pluto, even aside from his wife, Pluto is the last thing or person in the house that he does not abuse. Pluto is the last animal or person who is mistreated in this. Even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated, there's the intemperance, from one of my haunts, I fancied the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, and you have this violent sequence where he takes a small knife, what we would think of as like a letter opener. He takes this small knife and pulls out Pluto's eyeball in this like hideous, horrifying act of violence. And Poe's very intentional about this. He makes this both a thing the cat will survive and recover from, but also an act of violence that is very intentional and hideous and awful. And so he sets that juxtaposition of the survivable, but the awful and just like cold-blooded awfulness. He cuts one of the eyes out. The animal slowly recovers, and then you get what is maybe the most famous and important paragraph in the whole story. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. He went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left to first be grieved by this evident dislike, but this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit, philosophy takes no account. This is a central Gothic idea, of the Gothic and Romanticism, which Poe is arguably the key Romantic writer in this country during this time period pre-Civil War, in the 1800s pre-Civil War. Of this spirit, philosophy takes no account. That's a central Romantic idea, because he is saying there's some things that science can and that logic and reason and science and that the scientific method cannot explain. There are people's behaviors and impulses within human beings that there's no logic and that they cannot be reasoned with. The person can't be reasoned with, and the sort of impulses can't be reasoned with or reasoned out of. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am of perverseness, that this perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. And he means capital M, man, like mankind, like people, like all people. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he shouldn't? And this is one of the things Poe is interested in is, again, you come back to the idea that he is writing about psychology 40 or 50 years before we have the language of psychology. And this is, you can feel him pushing at that. Why do people have these impulses? Why do they act on them? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law merely because we understand it to be such? And so this perverseness, you get the combination of his alcohol, the main character's alcoholism, and the spirit, what he calls the spirit of perverseness. And it drives him to the second act of violence against the first cat, which is the equally horrifying hanging of the cat. Hung it with one morning in cool blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. This tree right out in their backyard, and he kills the cat. In this, so you have the pulling out of the eye, and then the outright killing of the cat. These two awful, horrible, disturbing acts of violence. That transitions you in the story, that gets you through the first section of the story because now you see that he has descended to this like horrible, he is tortured and then murdered an animal. That gets you into the sort of middle meat of the story, because that night, on the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of the fire. There's a house fire. The fire burns their whole house down. And the narrator steps back for a second in this next paragraph and says, I'm above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity. He says, look, I'm not so crazy that I'm trying to say that killing the cat led to the house fire. But hey, on the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. The one exception was found in a compartment wall, so like an interior wall, not very thick, which stood in the middle of the house, against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had there in great measure resisted the action of the fire. And I saw, as if graven in bas relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. And so on the wall above his bed, there is this sort of shadow image or silhouette of the cat with the noose around its neck. When I first held this apparition, my wonder and terror were extreme. And then he comes up with this explanation for how this could have happened. Somebody, when the house caught on fire, somebody could have seen the cat, threw it through the window, so it hit the wall. It doesn't really work, but again, he's an alcoholic trying to reason himself into why this fantastic, incredible thing has happened. Why the cat? He's trying to talk himself out of being haunted. But the middle section of the story gets you further and further into the haunting. Because although I thus readily accounted for my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, it did not less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half sentiment that seemed but was not remorse. And so seeing the silhouette of the cat, he sort of takes a step back. He gets control of the alcoholism a little bit. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal and as to look about me among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented for another pet of the same species. And so as much as he regrets what he has done, the alcoholism has him under control, and he is like going to what they would have called barrel houses, which is what he's about to get you to. But barrel houses were essentially bars where the walls were stacked with kegs and barrels of liquor and beer and alcohol. So that's why they're called barrel house, because you could see the barrels and the kegs and stuff like that, which is what you get in the next paragraph. One night, as I sat half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing on the head of one of the immense hogsheads. That would have been their word in the 1800s, a contemporary word for like a keg or a barrel of alcohol, of gin or rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I've been looking steadily at the top for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it, touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white. That indefinite splotch of white comes back later because it's not indefinite later, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. This is what people often refer to as the phantasm cat, the ghost cat, the haunting cat. And this is where you get, if you take the silhouette on the wall, the impression on the wall, and then the ghost cat on top of the barrel of alcohol, you have the narrator. This turns into a haunting story where the narrator is haunted. He is haunted by what he has done, and now he is physically, like, he is haunted. First the cat appears as just an image, then it appears as a full-size normal second ghost cat, and it begins to haunt him. He at first is like happy with the cat. He says, I continue, upon touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, appeared delighted. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. And so you get this sort of, again, when he says, I was feeling remorse for what I had done, and he welcomes this opportunity to have a second cat, and to try to treat it better. But almost immediately, for my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This is just the reverse of what I anticipated, but its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed, and by slow feelings, those feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. And so he ends up very quickly hating the ghost cat, because it becomes clear that the ghost cat is mimicking Pluto's behavior, following him everywhere, laying on top of him. But in that there is a darkness, a meanness to that mimic, to that sort of copying Pluto, the first cat's behavior, because he is being haunted. This is a haunting cat, and it is haunting him. I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery of the morning after I brought it home, that like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. Again, it's being haunted he's being haunted by the first awful act that he did to Pluto before he even killed the animal. And then he gives you this description. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. So the less he likes the cat, the more the cat seems to like him, or seems to haunt him. Wherever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and try to thus nearly throw me down. So it's not following him like Pluto did. It's trying to trip him, or fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress. At such times, I longed to destroy it with a blow. Yet I was yet withheld from doing so by my memory of my former crime. And then that all leads you to the wife's pointing out that the white spot on the second cat, the ghost cat's chest, looks like, he tells you, it was now, I say, the image of a ghastly thing of the gallows. So you have a ghost cat, a haunting cat, with the image of how the first cat was killed, this sort of reverse shadow, because it's a white shadow it's a white shadow on a black background, but this sort of reverse shadow of his second crime, which is outright killing the cat. So the cat has the missing eye, the first crime, and it shows the hanging of the cat on its chest and the white spot, the second crime. That gets you all down to the cellar of the house, where he says, one day she, his wife, accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. So this is their house. Now that their first house is blown down, they're living sort of in poverty in the best house they can find. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand. So the cat gets in between his feet and nearly trips him down the stairs going into the basement, into the cellar of the house. And he reaches to kill the cat with an axe. His wife reaches out to stop him, puts her hand on his arm, stops him. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. And so all this violence in the story has slowly escalated to the murder of another person, the pulling out the cat's eye, the murder of the cat, the haunting by the second cat. It all escalates into the first person he tells you he got violent with was his wife, and now he acts out that domestic violence leads to outright murder, and he kills the wife. The hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith to the task of concealing the body. He hides the body. He finds a space. He finds a space in the wall and knocks the walls down, and then puts his wife's body in there. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. And he finds a soft spot in the cellar, puts her in there, plasters her up in there, and is like, all right, I've gotten away with the crime. This is the perfect crime. I've hidden the body. I walled up the hole as before so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation, I was not deceived. And then after he gets the wife's body hidden, he remembers, he's like, oh, it was the cat that caused all of this. He goes to look for the cat and is like, I'm still going to kill the cat. But he can't find the cat anywhere. And he says, the blissful sense of, when he can't find the cat and he knows the wife's body is hidden, he says, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom, it did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at least Since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. And so he says, like, he got this night of sleep because the cat wasn't bothering him and sitting on him in his sleep, even though he has murdered his wife. Second and third day passed. The cat doesn't come back. Finally, on the fourth day, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house. The police show up. Obviously, there's a missing person. The police show up at the house, proceeded to make rigorous investigation of the premises. So the police are searching the house, trying to figure out what's happened to his wife. They left no nook or corner unexplored. For the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar, but I quivered not a muscle. My heart beat calmly, as that of one who slumbers in innocence. And so he's walking with the police. He's trying to stay cool. He's trying to stay calm. He's acting like he has no clue what has happened to his wife. Gentlemen, I said at last as the party ascends. So the police finally give up. They're like, all right, we're going back upstairs. We give up. We can't find any sign of her. I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. And then as the police are walking up the stairs, he, in some sort of like fit of what he says, frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane, which I held in my hand upon the very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. And as soon as he taps that wall, I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, a cry at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream. A howl. And if you've ever heard a cat howl at night, it's clear what's happening here. And the narrator is so shocked that he stumbles backwards away from the wall all the way across the room. The police then run back downstairs and tear the wall apart. And of course, there's the wife. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes, and upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast. And so it is not his wife howling, obviously. He has accidentally, in his sort of frenzy to hide the body, walled up the cat in there too. And so this combination of his sort of just like his intemperance and frenzy of darkness, to sort of like, I'm going to kill my wife and then hide her body, the sort of darkness that is totally and completely taken over him, combines with his sort of bravado and overconfidence when the police are there, and that leads him, he tells on himself. He accidentally confesses to the police by banging on the wall. And it is almost like he is in this sort of, he is totally out of control. He has totally lost control of himself to the point that he obviously is like murdering his wife, but also he can't stop himself from like banging on the wall and telling on himself and getting himself caught. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. And so the murder of the cat, he finally pays for the murder of the cat, because it is the sort of like his original sin, the pulling out the cat's eye and then murdering the cat. That is the beginning of his downward spiral, which leads him here to the murder of his wife, and then ultimately being caught. He catches himself. He is in the trap of his own alcoholism and darkness. And the haunting of the cat haunts him until finally he is caught and stopped. It leads to the sort of culmination and conclusion of the darkness and awfulness, and he is caught and stopped. And he is going, as to return to the beginning of the story, all of the violence against the cat and then against his wife, it's finally going to be stopped completely, because he won't be able to do any more awfulness and badness and act on his darkness anymore, because tomorrow he's going to be executed. I hope that helps you understand the black cat, and especially understand it as the story of somebody being haunted by alcoholism, haunted by their darkest impulses, haunted by their crimes. So this is really a sort of haunted story. You can see it as a haunted house story. You can see it as like a ghost haunting a person story, or somebody being haunted by their own darkness within them that is turned loose by his alcoholism. Again, I hope that it helps you understand the black cat, and also understand the black cat in the larger context a little bit of like Poe, the writer, and the Romantic movement in the early 1800s, 1800 to 1860 in this country.